Ladies and gentlemen, while since the morning we've heard about a number of things which the government hasn't done right over in its tenure over the last 4 years, there are two things which I think they can refer to as their achievements. And the first one of them actually is the announcement of the 7th NFC Award, the National Finance Commission Award, which substantially increased the resource availability to the provincial governments. The other landmark achievement of the current government is the announcement of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And if I can have the second slide. What this 18th Amendment to the Constitution did was, it abolished the concurrent legislative list, devolving those functions to the provincial government. It transferred some of the subjects from Federal Legislative List Part 1, which was solely federal, to Part 2, which meant joint responsibility of the federal and provincial governments. It also gave some borrowing powers to provincial governments to raise loans, subject to, of course, conditions specified by the National Economic Council and the federal government. And very importantly, it explicitly recognized sales tax on services and taxes on immovable property as part of the provincial fiscal domain. So a number of important considerations. Institutional implications also of the 18th Amendment. Basically what happened was 15 federal ministries or 17 divisions were devolved, reducing the size of the federal government from 50 to 32 divisions. However, over time, 9 more ministries were added and have been established since then, some of them being as random as the Ministry of National Harmony and so on and so forth. So the less said about it, the better. The role of the Council of Common Interest has been strengthened, as well as the National Economic Council. And both of them have now include more role of the provincial government. So the provinces have actually been strengthened. There has been fiscal decentralization and an enhancement in provincial autonomy. Effectively, how much of a change both of these developments have? First, concentrating on the 7th NFC Award. What this table basically tells you is the increase in revenue transfers to the provinces due to the award. In the year 2010-11, the first year after the announcement of the NFC Award, if revenues had taken place according to the previous revenue sharing arrangements, they would have been only 783 billion. They actually ended up being 997. So the NFC Award, the design of the award, actually increased the share of the provinces by 27%. It was substantial. So the design was favorable. But did that actually mean, or does that actually mean that we will now see better provision of services under provincial responsibility, particularly services, social services which are, in the domain of provincial government? For that to happen, it was very important that the revenue transfers or the additional revenues that were transferred were not substituted by a slackening of provincial own fiscal effort, whereby they reduced the tax collection and revenue collection from sources which were under their own fiscal domain. I'm afraid we did see that. Following the NFC Award, the provincial governments very proudly announced no tax budgets, which meant they were slackening their own fiscal effort. The other thing which is very important for the favorable consequences of the NFC Award to materialize was that we do not see profligacy in non-productive expenditures. And whatever fiscal space has been given to them is used for development and improvement in services. Did we see that? Well, following the first year after the NFC Award, there was a 50% increase in government salaries. Subsequently, there was a 25% or so increase again. And from the news, from whatever is coming in the papers, we can expect another big salary increase in the coming budget. So a lot of the revenue gains that were potential given to the provincial governments were preempted by increases in government salary. Also, for the medium-term consequences to be favorable, whatever development, the fiscal space was given to them should be used for development. And for them to properly use, it's very important for their provinces to develop a medium-term development framework so that they can rationalize their priorities. Now, given this transfer of funding from the federal to the provincial governments, the onus of development has shifted from the federal to the provincial governments. For the first time in the history of Pakistan, 60% of the development is taking place through the provinces, not by the federal government. So they have to do a good job of it. The federal government also needed to do a few things to minimize, so to say, the damage that such a big transfer could potentially cause to them. Now that they didn't have enough fiscal space, there was need for sharper prioritization of the federal PSDP, for it to be not wasted, for it to go to the priority sectors. It was also important that federal government increase the level of resource mobilization. Whatever fiscal powers they had, they should have gone in for a bigger fiscal effort. I'm afraid on both counts, not much has happened. And of course, there was also a need for economy in current expenditures. If they didn't do it, what would happen because of this large transfer to the provincial government was we could witness an increase in the consolidated fiscal deficit. And I'm afraid that is what we did witness. And the claims were that the NFC award has led to a situation whereby the structural deficit of the federal government will be higher now. Our calculation shows, yes, there is some merit to this argument. But the size of the structural deficit which will increase because of the NFC award is not as high as the federal government is claiming, but it is close to 0.5% of the GDP. So that was as far as the NFC award is concerned. How big is the magnitude of the 18th Amendment? To give you an impression of can we have the prior here? To give you a flavor of what the size of the magnitude and the magnitude of the transfer is, if the devolution plan, when it started in year 2010-11, was to take place faithfully at that time, all functions devolved, it would have meant a transfer of over $1 trillion from the federal to the provincial governments. And at the base of 2010-11, I'm sorry, 87 billion at 2010-11 base. This basically would mean a 7% increase in provincial budgets. So again, a sizable transfer, not an insignificant one. Did it actually happen? Let's see. The first budget after the 18th Amendment was 2011-12. Do we see that kind of a saving at the federal level? I'm afraid we did not see much of a saving at the federal level on the devolved subjects. In fact, if anything, there was an increase. And I think part of the reason for all of this was the political economy considerations. What happened was that when the services were devolved, because of political economy considerations, we had protests whereby the students were saying, don't devolve HEC. Then the federal employees were saying, we don't want to go down to the provinces. Provincial governments were saying, we don't want to absorb the federal employees. And then the federal government had a very big coalition government to accommodate. So all of those things added up. And we saw a rush, if I can call it so, whereby these additional ministries were created at the federal level. And in effect, there was no saving, despite the fact that the number of subjects were devolved to the provinces. At the provincial level, what happened? The provincial governments allocated, in the budget, previous one, the provincial governments allocated only 7.5 billion additional resources for the devolved subjects. So in effect, there was no real big devolution which took place, at least at the when you look at the financial side to it. So I guess what we can conclude, as far as the 7th NFC award is concerned, it empowered the provinces by increasing financial resources, but of course there is the danger that it can increase the consolidated fiscal deficit. Both the provincial and the federal level of government have to change, have to respond to the new dispensation. Until and unless they do this, the effectiveness gets drained away. The 18th Amendment had the potential of changing the structure of governance in Pakistan, but the way it was implemented, I'm afraid effective decentralization has been postponed. What can we do to make this devolution effective? It's a good thing, probably there is agreement by and large, but what needs to be done? On the financing side, I'm afraid what should happen after the end of the tenure of the 7th NFC award, because the current arrangements are that federal government will continue to finance a number of important services which are devolved to the provincial governments. They include higher education, they continue to finance higher education, HECs with them. Population welfare continues to be funded by the federal government, and population welfare and health continue to be funded by the federal level. This kind of an arrangement whereby you devolve delivery to a lower tier, but you continue to fund it, I'm afraid has not gone down well in Pakistan. We had recently a situation where the lady health workers were storming the provincial secretariat because they were not paid. They were not paid because they now are reporting to the provincial government, but funding is coming from the federal government. So this kind of a situation creates what may be referred to as a principal agent's problem, and we need to resolve it. One way would be when the next NFC award, which will hopefully come into effect after 2014-15, the vertical share of the provincial government should enhance so that the 18th Amendment can be fully reflected. Also, it is very important that we incentivize higher provincial owned effort. Provincial governments have to be put at a spot whereby they need to mobilize resources which are under their own fiscal domain. Big ones, all taxation of services, select taxation of services is under their fiscal domain. Immovable property is in their fiscal domain. Agricultural income is in their fiscal domain. These are three potentially large and buoyant sources which they are not doing a good job of exploiting. So we need to incentivize this. And there are countries who have done that. India, for example, in its NFC award, incentivizes and has a criteria for own subnational fiscal effort. Then another possible mechanism of enhancing the financing available to the provincial governments following to perform these functions more is perhaps to allow them to borrow. This is something that the 18th Amendment has done. It has allowed the possibility of subnational governments to borrow. But when I say they should be allowed to borrow, they should be allowed to borrow after promulgation of some fiscal rules. We don't want to see a repeat of some, the fiscal discipline problems that some of the South American countries witnessed, or even for that matter, India. The provincial debt is a very big problem. So we need to first promulgate some fiscal rules. And in fact, few of them, for example, I have given to you here. The first and the second rule will ensure that the provinces will continue to generate enough revenue surplus to finance their ADPs, and that all borrowings will be used for financing investment and not current expenditure, which is the case at the federal level. Then the second and the third rule will prevent the outstanding debt from rising to unsustainable level. That is also very important. The final rule will prevent excessive resort to off-budget commitments and thereby avoid the risk of large contingent liabilities on the provincial consolidated fund. The other thing that I guess needs to be focused on if devolution is to be made effective is that delivery of services has to be improved. Now, in its zeal very quickly announced the 18th Amendment, there were a lot of details which one feels sitting outside which were not worked out properly, and they remain pending. And they can lead to a number of issues which can hamper or which can hinder delivery of service. The first example was, of course, the AGC. Students were on the streets. The Supreme Court had to give a stay order. We don't want that kind of a situation. And some of the emerging issues which the government needs to resolve, for example, in the health sector, is registration of drugs, fixation of prices of drugs, very important issues. How is that going to happen? In the context of food and agricultural division, how will inter-provincial supplies of meat be managed, for example? Who would be importing meat at the time of shortage? Who will decide it? Will the provinces play that kind of a role? We need to sit down and decide that. Who will fix the procurement prices, for example, is an important issue. In the context of labor and manpower division, who will operate the national security schemes, social security schemes? In fact, the issue has already come up regarding the EOBI and Workers' Welfare Fund. These are agencies at the federal level, and they haven't been devolved to the provincial government with the Division of Labor and Manpower under the 18th Amendment. The provinces are happy about it. They want devolution, the decentralization of that also. Something again not yet decided. And how will the assets? There are billions there. How will they be distributed among the provinces is some of the things that need to be decided. Coming to natural resources, again a very important area opened up. Who will grant concessions to oil and gas exploration companies now that 50% of the ownership is with the federal and 50% with the provincial governments? Will the provincial governments have a 50% share in the ownership of government equity in corporations like the BPL, OGDC? We don't know yet. To what extent should power sector be decentralized to the province? In the morning session, the discussion was very clear that power shortage in Punjab is crippling the economy in particular. What role can the province play in all of this? If it goes ahead and generates the electricity, who will distribute it? Are the provinces clear that the distribution is under them? Will they go ahead and take this? At this point of time, NIPRA is the one deciding not only the tariffs but also the distribution. So a number of issues remain pending, and I'm afraid they are hindering delivery, and they need to be resolved and addressed. Then effective devolution to local government is one of the other issues. My previous two speakers have very, very clearly highlighted, I agree with them totally, that if devolution is to be comprehensive in this country, local governments have to be made operative and they need to be strengthened. The problem with 2001 devolution was that there was no devolution from the federal to the provincial governments. Only the provinces were asked to devolve to the local governments. They were not willing to let go. They were just not willing to give up the power. Now is the time. They've got a plate full because of the 18th Amendment. They should let go and let the provincial, local governments do a good job of local services. That's one thing that needs to be taken care of. Now, another area is planning and execution. With the shift of the public sector development activity to the provinces, as I was saying, it's 60% of the PSDP now with the provinces. The planning basically should shift towards bottom-up planning, with greater emphasis on spatial rather than sectoral planning and consistency thereof. It's very important. It should be bottom-up now that the provinces are playing an important part. Planning Commission's role should more or less be of coordinating the provincial plans. And of course, needless to say, with some money at their disposal, planning and responsibility at their hands, the provincial capacity for planning needs to be strengthened, particularly in the smaller provinces like Balochistan, where they have this load of money and they really don't know what to do with it. And we see that there are big surpluses. In both these the 2 years, they've carried big surpluses, partly because of lack of capacity to use it properly. That needs to be strengthened. Basically, the bottom line is, for devolution to work, there need to be a number of resolutions of emerging problems for improved service delivery. Financing needs to be resolved, and the provincial governments needs to strengthen and get their act together. With that, I think I have exhausted my time. Thank you.